Thank you for listening to the Travis Talks Education Podcast. Today's episode 005, What if higher education adopted the NCAA Academic Progress Rate? That is right. Today's episode is talking about a good policy that the NCAA has, whether you think they do or not, and it talks about retention and then progress towards degree completion. So throughout the podcast, my goal is to give an honest opinion about policies, both in higher education and the NCAA, and also highlight the good ones and the good metrics that the NCAA has and how I think it can relate to higher education to try and think about innovation or simplifying things and how to measure things to bring action. And so today's episode is going to talk about retention, how we can measure it, and how we can measure the degree completion or at least progress towards degree on a term-by-term basis instead of waiting 6 years or retention rate after 2 years or another year. This is going to simplify it, break it down for one semester at a time, and what institutions could do if they had that information quicker. Now, one thing I always like to talk about is the benefits that the NCAA has in regards to collaboration. Now, what that means is they have policies that creates data collection at scale, meaning they can get every Division I school, then they can get all those schools, require them to submit this data, and then they have that for the research team. So the data collection at scale creates data-driven decision-making and progress. And so in the Department of Education, and in my opinion, both the state and the federal level, change doesn't happen a lot because it's hard to kind of get everyone on the same page. You're talking about a lot of data collection, throwing laws in there. Now the NCAA, though, they can vote on their own legislation. The policies can change. The research team can do a lot of different things with the data. In the next few episodes, I'm going to talk about different approaches that the NCAA does with this academic research. And the APR is a big piece of that because in it you have your retention rate, your progress rate, and then all the other the information that comes with it. So this leads me to believe that if somehow we could get the Department of Education to kind of create a comparable reporting requirement, then we might see better policy and better results, such as how to measure timely degree completion or maybe a scorecard for schools that is more accurate towards what students and families need to think about. So today's episode brought to you by AdvisEdu. AdvisEdu is a think tank company that I recently created where we focus on the innovation in higher education from an NCAA academic policy standpoint, talk about every major topic that you could think of in higher education and how it's going to be seen through the eyes of the NCAA. If you want to learn more about the projects and white papers working on right now, as always, can visit the website advisedu.com. That's AdvisEdu.com. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to keep up with the conversation at Travis Higher Ed. Just recently had a Twitter debate last week, towards the end of the week, about APR, because as you know, the NCAA came out with the APR annual releases, which talks about the 4-year average APR score and some misinterpretation of how people see the APR. But this also led to pretty much every school in Division I athletics that had good scores. They would have their press releases out saying, we compete just as well in the classroom. That might be true, but as you'll see at the beginning of this episode, APR is really about progressing towards that degree and retaining your student athletes. So there are some flaws with it. I look at APR differently than most, but if you want to follow along that, you can just scroll through my Twitter feed and see who's right, me or the critics of the NCAA. To kind of give an update of what APR is again, the APR is a real-time measurement of student progress and retention. It is not about measuring learning. Now, the whole purpose of it is kind of a simplified measurement of a 2-point system. And the way I look at it has nothing to do with the 4-year average that you see whenever you see a press release from the NCAA or the schools. I look at it as someone that did this on campus for 3 years. I tracked APR and the great things you can do with it. So here's how it basically goes. 2-point system for each scholarship athlete and for each term. So this is an every term measurement. Now you get 1 point for a retention point, meaning you came back. You get 1 point for being academically eligible or graduated. So every student athlete that is on scholarship gets a 2-point possible score. Now, if they get 2 for 2, then great. If they get 1 for 2, okay. If they get an 0 for 2, that's going to be a problem. So we'll talk about that, but basically you just keep it as a running spreadsheet, and you can calculate it, you can project it pretty easily, and so it's a great measurement. Now, scoring APR, you add all the points earned, divide by all the points possible, and then you multiply it by 1,000. So that's how you get that pretty score of 975 out of 1,000. 1,000 is a perfect score. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert as far as why the 930 is equivalent to a 50% graduation rate, but according to NCAA research, that is what a 930 means. And 930, why that kind of triggers in people's head when they think of APR, it's because that is the threshold that teams must meet to be eligible for competition, postseason competition. Now, this used to be a 2-year average, and then recently, a couple years ago, it changed to a 4-year average. So basically, you take your 4 most recent year scores for each team, and that is your 4-year average score. It needs to be above a 930. And that's also what they use when they factor out these recognitions of the top 10% of each sport that you see press releases from different schools. So I love the APR, but I love it as a single year measurement that you can also break it down by total APR or academic rate or the retention rate. What I don't necessarily like is the 4-year average, and here's why. Now, it does get a bad rep because of the 4-year average for access championships because, like I said, people think, you're saying a 930, you only need a 50%. And also, the people don't necessarily understand what the APR means. Now, the whole purpose of it was to make it a quicker measurement, and then the federal graduation rate or the graduation success rate. And what I agree with that is, why do we need the 4-year average then? And I've heard some people say, you want to see something over a span of 4 years. Well, if anyone's ever worked in college athletics, you're going to know that regardless of the sport, there's going to be a lot of turnover from that freshman year to the senior year. You ever notice how there's a lot of freshman athletes on a football team, but the senior year, there's a lot less. So it is kind of not necessarily a revolving door, but, students do change out, and it's always replaced with JUCO transfers or 4-year transfers or just new freshmen every year. So I like the 1-year APR score for that reason. And so I just don't understand if we're going to do a real-time measurement. I'm sure there is a reason from NCAA research, and I'll ask them next time I speak with them, hopefully here soon. But what I don't agree with is why we need that average score for access to championships, when in reality, the single year, the what have you done for me lately, is similar to what goes on in athletics. So think about my argument for this is, if we're going to say that a single year can't be used for academic championship access, but think about college football. You have to win 6 games to get a bowl game invite, or ironically enough, if there's not enough 6-win teams, then they look at your APR score. But what I do think is we already have these thresholds in place. So in football, you need the 6 games. And then in basketball and many other sports, you compete to win enough games to be an at-large, or you win your conference tournament and you're an automatic qualifier. So nothing's a sure thing. I mean, your powerhouse teams, you can obviously, we know Alabama is going to win 6 games, so they're probably going every year. But my biggest concern is, don't tell me that we can't do the single year, because we can. We do that in the athletic side, so why not kind of balance it out? Now, like I said, they might have a reason. I just don't see it. And I really think that NCAA should consider either adopting the 1-year score, because it's very similar to what they're about to do in the academic revenue distribution, where it's a 1-year score. Did you meet the requirement or not? And that's an institution-wide one, but the 1-year score is going to be used for that. At a minimum, I think they should go back to the 2-year average, because it's more reflective, I think, of the coach. So is the coach going to be there for 4 years? Are they adopting someone else's APR mess? And I really think that if we're going to hold the access to championships, it should be we shouldn't punish athletes that weren't there 3 years ago if there was 2 bad scores while they were still in high school. So I don't know. I just think the 1-year score is better for what we're trying to do. So that is my kind of spiel on the 4-year average, why I don't like it. and kind of the last week of why schools you started seeing the APR come up more. It was just the annual release. And now I want to kind of shift gears for the rest of the podcast episode to talk about what if higher education adopted APR, okay? So I mentioned there's more than one thing. I think the biggest thing in here for higher education is going to be for retention. And I've been following really ever since I got the idea of AdvisEdu months ago. I started following higher education organizations on Twitter. So there's a handful. I don't want to list a couple because I'll forget the rest. But I'm learning a lot from them as far as what white papers they're doing, research they're doing, and noticing that retention is a hot topic for everyone. And not only that, but timely completion of a degree. And the reason being is because they're kind of being held to the fire for their funding based on how they perform in these areas. So that kind of triggered in my head as like, I'm seeing all these suggestions, and I was like, APR does this and we can track it. It's very easy. Anyone can do that math. If I can do the math, then you definitely can. I'm not a statistics major or anything like that. I can dabble in some spreadsheets and some calculations, but the APR is by far the easiest thing I've ever measured. And so kind of shifting gears, what if higher ed did adopt it? Adopting the NCAA APR retention point would allow the retention conversation to be more clear, track retention at more than just freshman and sophomore year gap. That's the only time we seem to do it, is how many of our students are coming back from freshman year to sophomore year. I agree it's a very important time in a student's life, but if you can track it by semester and then you see all of a sudden, why are these sophomore to juniors slipping out mid-year and going somewhere else, then maybe you have some underlying issues that you can focus on. And everywhere across the university can do that. And I really do think that we just need one metric that more schools and maybe athletic conferences can lead the way, where higher ed in those schools want to adopt the APR because they can have the experts on their campus that knows how to do it. But I think it would just be a more accurate way to detail student retention, and then that way you can come up with the intervention strategies. Another benefit to the retention point in all of APR really is you can see trends in different demographic populations to see if there are other solutions for different groups of students. So maybe we're seeing, our white males are doing worse than our white females, or our out-of-state students or our African-American students are having harder issues with the retention. And I think those are, anytime you can see a trend, we know this data is already out there. If we can have a very easy metric, then I think we can do a lot with it on our institutions. And then the other thing is, obviously it has a good idea of trying to tell the consumer how this school looks at retention. And when you look this up, it depends on which website you're going to that you're going to see your retention rate. And then once again, you're seeing maybe a 4-year average retention rate of all the freshman classes to sophomore year. That doesn't really tell me anything. I want to know, what have you done for me lately? So if I'm looking at an academic transparency scorecard, as I suggested in an earlier podcast, then this would be something that would be on there. I'd love to see the institution's retention rate. Then you go to the higher ed adopted the progress point. So we talked about the retention rate. Now let's talk about the other part of it. So in the NCAA world, this is called the eligibility point. My whole thing is, for higher education, they would probably want to change it. So if you just use progress point for an example, for each term, so the NCAA uses a 6-hour. Now we're talking about credit hour system. So if you're on quarter system, it'd be a little different. But for simplicity, they have what's called the NCAA 6-hour rule. So after every semester, did you pass 6 credits? Then that can be used as your eligibility point. So if you're in higher ed institution and 12 credits is considered full-time, and that equates to 5-year graduation, we can do simple math there too, then you're on pace to graduate in 5 years. Now, a lot of people are doing the 15 to finish, and I agree with that. I think that's important. But for simplicity, if you wanted to do the progress point, you could take the 12 credit hour rule. So I want to do a 1-point system for all my full-time students to track their progress, see how many of them passed all 12 credits. You can drop it down to 9 if you want, but I mean, it's not like you're being punished. I think it'd be good to see you're taking 12 credits. How are you doing of degree credit? So, and that tells you I'm paying this financial aid out. How are they doing? You can kind of see how your institution's doing at getting them in 12, how many are passing 12, how many are only taking 12 and passing 9. Then you lose that point. You can go back and look at these points that you're missing. And you can also do a separate one if you want to track your part-time students. So obviously part-time is less than 12 credits. Maybe you want to use that as a separate kind of tracking progress for your part-time students is important to your institution, your school of adult learning, whatever you want to do. If you have different subgroup of students, then if you want to kind of take the progress point, split it to 2 or 3, but then you compare it back, you throw it all back into the overall point system, then you're fine. So I think this would be easily identifiable to kind of say, okay, let's do a part-time one, let's do a full-time one, and then lump it all back into the overall progress point. So then you have your retention point, and now you have your progress point. And what's great is you can actually study, once you run your report, where are we getting these 0 for 1s, these 0 for 2s? You ask anyone in your athletic department, they know exactly what they're going to do right whenever they do APR. They're going to scroll through that spreadsheet, find out all the zeros, and then they're going to research, why are we getting zeros? You can track it all the way back to who they recruited. Just like at a higher education institution, you can see who did you recruit, what was their admit status, and you can kind of see better ways to do things or better support systems that you need in certain groups. Maybe you look at it and it's all over the board. Then maybe it's just chance. Students have different things going on in their lives that we can't track. But if you can identify trends in either the progress point or the retention rate point, then that's huge. So you get your overall score, and it's the exact same process, right, as athletics. So you take up all those points, and then you add them together. You divide them by the points possible and multiply it by 1,000, and you have a score, right? And then you can compare it to different demographics, different admit types, different genders, whatever you want to do, different majors. You can learn a lot about your institution, and it can all be pulled from one giant report. Now, what exactly would the score mean? That's up to the institution, I would think, but maybe your state or the federal Department of Education wants to come up with a threshold that they deem appropriate. Then all of a sudden we can track everyone, at least have a scorecard that we can all be held to the same thing as, just like the NCAA is. And yeah, every institution is going to have different admission status as far as maybe they're open admissions, maybe they brag about only accepting a very small percentage of students. Does it matter? Yes. But remember, this is retention rate. This is a progress rate. It's just a way to see everything in one spreadsheet. So yeah, it'd be great that we can compare everyone across the country, including comparing them to our student athletes. But it really can be an institutional thing where leaders at your institution, faculty at your institution can look at this. Every department, every demographic, admissions, everyone can come together and see the same spreadsheet, and they can make decisions and they can adjust policy around it. And then looking towards ways to bring more students in because they have a high retention rate that you can boast about. And then you can keep more students on campus, progress them towards graduation, get more degrees awarded, and kind of follow through on that commitment to earning a degree. So the next question to kind of talk about is who would track the APR for your institution. Now, right now in your athletic department, the ones doing APR are most likely the assistant and associate athletic director for compliance or the director of athletic academics, whatever those various titles are, but it's probably one of those two individuals, or if you're at a larger institution, it's probably multiple individuals tracking APR. But what you'll realize is it's a pretty easy and simplified measurement. So it's easy to calculate by running a report, but you can also just keep up your own spreadsheet. For athletics, they just probably keep their own spreadsheet, go through it with a one-point system as far as when you're calculating it out. But at the institution level, I'm sure you can work with your registrar's office or whoever does your reports and come up with a report based on the metrics that are decided. So if we're doing 12 credits earned of full-time students, and we can obviously set up a quick report that shows all the full-time students that have their credit hours that they earned under 12 credits and how many earned 12 or more. Really don't think that would be a problem. And then as far as retention, everyone has their own way of tracking that. So whether they're enrolled, you can kind of project it. If they're not enrolled for the next semester, that's probably a sign if they get kicked out based off of not being in good academic standing, or they indicate they're going to transfer. All those things are recorded anyways. Now for the official way, I'm going to talk about this in a future episode, but the NCAA does have an academic portal that institutions are required to submit their APR for the previous year in the fall. So they get all summer to kind of collect it, know for sure if they're coming back, and then send that information out. So higher education could be the exact same thing, but it won't take a village or a whole department to do this. It can be a couple people in the registrar's office that runs a report, kind of simplifies it, comes up with the best way to run it, and then submits it to whatever the database is. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. And then we talk about, obviously, students transfer, right? And then students graduate later on. So the NCAA does have things in place for transfer students. This would be kind of an adjustment for someone at the institution to do. So for right now, for example, you can have a transfer student leave, but they're in good academic standing, and then they don't necessarily cost a point for retention for the school. And you're probably thinking, wait, why wouldn't they get a 0 out of 1 for retention? Well, based on the NCAA research team, they say that a 2.6 cumulative GPA leads for a transfer likelihood of transferring and still earning a degree. So basically, if you're a student athlete and you have a 2.6 and you transfer, you don't cost your institution the retention point. So, and I actually like it. So I didn't understand it at first until I actually spoke to some people at the NCAA about it at a conference. But I do think it's good, because if you're the institution, you shouldn't necessarily be punished just because someone transfers. They transfer for different reasons, but I do think we have a responsibility to track their progress and kind of make sure that they're doing things the right way while they're there. So why be punished if they have a 2.6 or some type, whatever metric you want to use? But if there's a threshold in there that they meet that and then they leave, then okay, we're not going to penalize you for having a student transfer whenever you did your job as far as helping them be in good academic standing. Because if they have a higher GPA, more transfer credits going into another institution, things like that. So you could have something set up in that where you go through your list of retention and you see how many people transferred, what was their GPA at transfer, were they in good academic standing, and you can have a threshold adjustment there by someone at your institution. And then it's delayed graduation point. So the NCAA has also a professional adjustment, but maybe higher education could do something like that for military adjustment if they wanted to, but we don't really have to worry about too many of our students going pro without the degree, because most of them are in college to get a degree for a professional job of some sort. But we do have what's called delayed graduation point. So when a student returns to graduate, then the progress point could be retroactively either added to the original score or included in the new score. Either way, higher education, you could get, for your institution, you could get that point back later on for someone that you actually reached out to, got to come back to your institution and graduated. So you could get that retention point back, and then you could also get that graduation point, which is the progress rate. So I think that is a good way to kind of track the two other things that higher education specifically would face in transfer students in delayed graduation. And yes, someone would manually have to be doing that and overseeing all of this, but even if you have 15,000 students, 30,000 students, it is not something that is going to take a month to do. This is a fairly quick but amazing metric as far as measuring retention, and then that they're progressing towards a degree by getting 24 to 30 credit hours every year. And the final piece to this episode is kind of talking about what if the Department of Education annually posted the APR of each school. So say in a perfect world, from the Travis Talks Education podcast, we just hatched a great idea that every higher education institution has to have APR. Now, will it happen? No, probably not. But hey, let's just get the ideas out there, claiming it. If it happens, then you heard it here first on the Travis Talks Education podcast. But what would happen if everyone did? For one, we would have a better academic scorecard for retention and progress towards degree, because we'd have a real-time report card for institutions to demonstrate those rates. So we could, kind of have a consumer report as far as if you're a parent or you're a prospective student, you would see real-time information for how they're doing every semester. And then that way you can kind of compare and contrast different schools, where right now you're kind of just relying on rankings. And these are real information that are relevant, that isn't something from whenever you were still in middle school with a graduation rate. You can actually see how are they progressing each term. And then you could actually, funding could be tied to the APR score. So similar to how the NCAA academic revenue distribution is going to be. Now, right now, yes, there's performance funding in higher education already. This would just be an easier metric that everyone would have a target goal that they're shooting for. So whether it's the state level or the federal level, you could look at different funding levels versus different scores. So say you get a 950, you get a 975 to 1,000, then maybe you get more money, but you could even take it from the retention rate or the progress rate, what have you. But essentially, this would be an easier way, in my opinion, for funding to be tied to it. And then other things, you could see demographic and the societal differences in academic success. So anytime that you just see a score, maybe you want to see students that either look like you or studying the same thing as you or come from the same background as you and going to the same school that you're going to go to. These are all different things that we could have a search function in there that you could see, okay, here's how the Travis Smith demographic. So white male, going to Indiana University, medium family income, however you want to do it, then you can actually see where you fit in. So there's not a privacy concern because we're not seeing Travis Smith named on there, but you would be able to kind of compare and contrast people that are in your similar situation and how that you could be kind of predicted to do on stats at that institution and different institutions along the way. And the final thing that I was thinking about with this, as far as what we would get out of everyone posting it, for those of you who aren't aware, head coaches at the NCAA, different sports actually have an APR portfolio, meaning their score follows them around everywhere they go. Now, you could actually have that for presidents and provosts if you really wanted to, that they have an APR score wherever they go, to kind of improve those scores or kind of tie it to them. I don't think this would happen because no one would probably support that idea, and you can't blame it all on the president or provost. It's a little different when you're a coach and you're the ones recruiting those students, but that is one kind of interesting factor that the NCAA actually has that I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of, that it does follow every coach around with them. So kind of holds them accountable. And then don't get me started on academic progress rate bonuses for coaches, but those are definitely things we don't need for presidents and provosts to have APR bonuses tied to them too. So we don't want to get too far involved as far as what athletic departments do with their APR bonuses. But essentially, I do think you're going to find some great, unique ways for institutions to come up with better solutions for problems that they can see in real time. So instead of looking at 4 or 5 different measurements, you can look at one spreadsheet. You can break it down in the different ways, the retention, the progress, what have you, overall score. You can search all your 0 for 2s and see, where are we missing? See any trends that you might have. Do an APR improvement plan. That's right. The NCAA actually requires institutions to develop and submit a very thorough APR improvement plan for those 4-year average under 930 as conditions to kind of regain being in good standing with the NCAA requirements. So think about what can be learned if you pull different departments together across your entire institution. If you don't like the APR score, the retention score, the progress score that you're seeing every semester, if it's trending a bad way, then as an institution, that's a siren that goes off, and you do an APR improvement plan that you can rely on to kind of be a guiding light to try and improve everything on your campus. And that wraps up the discussion for today about higher education adopting the NCAA APR. Now, the theme will continue into the next episode. For a little preview, just so you're aware, what's coming down the pipe is higher education adopting progress towards degree that the NCAA requires. And this is something that I am very passionate about as far as education completion, because the NCAA does do a good job at the calculation involved for progress towards degree. And we're not just looking at overall credits, we're looking at all of the degree components required. So we're going to break down what that means in NCAA world and how it's different than higher education, and degree tracking software, things like that you need to be paying attention to, because the numbers can lie when we see someone's at 120 credits but they're not graduating. So just kind of another way that the NCAA doing things the right way, kind of leading the way in higher education, should follow suit, in my opinion. So that'll be the next episode. And as always, just visit AdvisEdu.com. That's AdvisEdu.com. Learn more about what we're working on there as far as upcoming white papers, projects, topic areas. If you ever have anything you want to debate about or talk to me about, you can hit the contact page on the website or follow me on Twitter at Travis Higher Ed. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Please be sure to rate and subscribe, and you'll get all the upcoming episodes, and leave some comments so that I can kind of see what you'd like to see with the podcast and the direction taking shape. Until next time, I am Travis Smith, and thank you for listening to the Travis Talks Education Podcast.